Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Thursday, June 20th, 2019, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With us today for the Center on the American Governor is David Socolow, who served as the Commissioner of the Department of Labor and Workforce Development in the administration of New Jersey's 45th Governor, John Corzine. David, welcome to Eagleton.
Thank you so much.
Let's start at the beginning of your career. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, what got you interested in politics and public policy.
Well, I grew up here in New Jersey. I grew up in Princeton, went to Princeton High School, public schools all the way through. Was very interested in science.
And I should point out that your father was at the university and he is a scientist.
My dad is a scientist. He's been on the faculty for 48 years, recently retired after 48 years at Princeton. But I thought I wanted to do science, but I was also very interested in public issues and public policy, and went off to college and realized that my inclinations were more towards using rational reason to solve problems, but not necessarily as a scientist. And so I decided I wanted to do politics and government to try to solve social problems.
And where did you decide this? Where did you discover this?
Oh, I was at Harvard for undergraduate and I graduated in 1991. At that time, there was a special election for United States Senate in Pennsylvania, right next door here. And so right out of college, that's what I went off and did, and worked on a special Senate race, which had a remarkably unexpected and wonderful result for a guy named Harris Wofford, who won that Senate race, talking about kitchen table bedrock issues, health insurance, jobs, the economy. He had actually been the labor secretary for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as well as a civil rights leader and an aide to Martin Luther King and John Kennedy. And so he was a real inspiration. And so I caught the bug.
What did you do in that campaign?
Oh, I helped out with fundraising. I was I was right out of college. I was basically helping him make his phone calls and figuring out who to call to ask for money.
So you were were you the person who picked up the phone and called and had people hang up on him?
Pretty much. That's what I did. Yes, and especially toward the beginning when we were down by 47 points to the former two-term governor of the state, who was the sitting United States Attorney General at the time, Richard Thornburg. No one gave us any chance of winning that election. And so it was a small band of happy warriors with this amazing fellow, Harris Wofford, sort of fighting the good fight. And it was a very short campaign because it was a special election just from May to November. And then he won in November of '91, and I sort of caught the bug and stayed in that line of work.
And what did you do after that?
I went and worked on a different Senate race in New York for a year for a candidate named Bob Abrams, who was running against Al D'Amato for United States Senate in New York. And then I came down to Washington, D.C. And started working on other political races, worked for a political consulting firm for a couple of years.
This was the fundraising management group?
Yeah, it was, yeah. So we worked for the Senator Wofford's re-election campaign, which was in the '94 cycle. We worked for another U.S. Senator named Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico, and a couple of other candidates as well.
So was this a PAC?
No, it was a consulting firm that individual candidates would hire to help them train their staff and give them advice on how to run their campaigns.
And what was the American Resources Information Network, which was your next assignment?
Yeah, so my next assignment was working on one particular issue. It was one of the issues, the planks of the Contract with America, which was the Newt Gingrich platform from the '94 election. After that '94 election, there were a whole lot of radical ideas that were being proposed, especially by the new majority in the House of Representatives. And one of those was this issue of essentially stopping all forms of regulation by calling it a takings under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And so the ARIN, the American Resources Information Network, was a coalition of lobbying groups, of nonprofit groups working to point out the flaws with that idea, which ultimately did not go anywhere, but I worked on that for a couple of years.
The idea ultimately didn't go anywhere.
That policy idea, which was introduced in the House, and there was hearings, and we worked to try to get the opposing view into the political mainstream.
So you moved from campaign operative to policy operative.
Yeah, which was always what I had wanted to do. I worked on campaigns so that I could have an influence on policy. I wanted to do policy, but I understood, or at least I was given some advice by a number of people, including the late Alan Karcher, who had been Speaker of the New Jersey General Assembly and had spent a semester at Harvard when I was there. And he said, if you want to do anything in policy and government, you really should work on campaigns first and understand how these politicians interact with their constituents and what it takes to get them elected. So I took that advice for the first 3 years out of college.
I see. Okay, and then the fourth year?
Right. So then, after that work on the Aaron effort to stop this takings legislation, I was fortunate enough to be selected to run the Washington, D.C. office of a New Jersey congressman, Rob Andrews, and so I was essentially his legislative director. The administrative assistant is what they called it back then. It's like a deputy chief of staff. Had
you known Congressman Andrews before?
I had not known him. I had seen him speak a number of times when I was working in '91 for Harris Wofford. They were working together on trying to prevent the closing of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. And so I had seen him that way.
A very important thing for Rob Andrews' district, which was Camden and that
Indeed,
area.
in which his father had worked at that shipyard, and so it was very personal and also a huge source of jobs in that southern Jersey area. And so, and of course, Wofford, as a Pennsylvania senator, had been working on that as well, and so I did know him a little bit from that, but he didn't know who I was.
How'd you get the job?
I interviewed for it. I had Harris call him, and Senator Wofford called him and gave him a reference, which I think he was impressed by. And I got the job. And so, I began working for him for almost 4 years at that point. First running the DC office, and then about a year later running the entire operation as his chief of staff.
Now in 1997.
Yeah.
He ran in the primary for governor against, I guess, a number of candidates. I don't really remember all the details, but the main candidate whom he ran against was Jim McGreevey.
Right.
And actually, if I'm not mistaken, Rob Andrews entered that race as a favorite, but McGreevey overtook him. Were you involved in that campaign, or were you hatch-acked out of
No, I started out as I was still running the DC office at the time, just helping out in my spare time with some policy stuff. We were doing basically opposition research on the congressman's own congressional record. He had 6 years of congressional votes and bill sponsorships and things that we wanted to make a catalog of what he had done and said, just to make sure that we knew any potential vulnerabilities and had the answers prepared in advance. So we did some of that work in my spare time in addition to my my regular governmental duties. And then I took a leave of absence for the last 2 or 3 months of that primary and went up to New Jersey and helped out on the campaign.
And then when he lost that primary, well, of course, he's still in Congress.
Yes.
So you go back to your old job?
I went right back to my old job. Actually, at that point, I got promoted to be the chief of staff. So I started splitting my time between New Jersey and Washington, sort of following Rob's schedule, the congressman's schedule, which was to go down to D.C. During voting days and be in the district as much as possible. And we worked on a number of important issues, including that period from sort of '97 till the end of '98 was when both the Workforce Investment Act, the federal job training law, was rewritten in Rob's subcommittee, and the Higher Education Act of 1965 was reauthorized. That's done every 5 to 10 years, and that also went through the same subcommittee. And I was very, very heavily involved in both of those efforts.
A harbinger of 2 jobs that you were much later in your career to have.
Exactly. It really was. I had been in general interested in social policy, domestic policy, social justice. Trying to help disadvantaged people get opportunity in our society, and those 2 issues, as well as some of the others we worked on in the labor committee that Rob was on, really gave me a grounding in a certain subset of fields.
In 2000, there was a Democratic primary for United States Senate, between Jim Florio, who had preceded Rob Andrews as first district congressman, and this newcomer, John Corzine.
Right.
Were you in any way involved in that campaign? Did your position as the chief of staff of the first district congressman put you in any kind of a position?
No, by that point I had left. I left Rob's office at the end of '99 and went to work for the Clinton administration for the final year at the U.S. Department of Labor under Secretary Alexis Herman and Deputy Secretary Ed Montgomery. That's where I was. And so I was heads down working on my job, learning my new job, working in the federal government.
That's your first job in the executive branch.
That was my first time ever in the executive branch, and it was eye-opening. It was a heady time because it was that year 8 of 8, trying to get things done at the last minute. Obviously, hoping that the President Clinton might be succeeded by a successor that was his own vice president. That was certainly the goal of the campaign people, but we were operating as if we were short-timers because you never know what kind of turnover there might be, even with a change of presidents between the presidents of the same party.
So this was a political appointee?
I was senior advisor to the deputy secretary, which means gopher.
Right.
And so, but I was very heavily involved in helping him manage the decision-making process and all kinds of things in terms of regulations, response to oversight from the Hill, with lots and lots of questions that they were asking to try to get information. We were involved in all of that, as well as last-minute deal making on some grand bargain issues related to some policy issues that I was working on.
And was it the labor bill that had gone through Congressman Andrews' subcommittee that had you focused on or got you interested specifically in the labor field?
Yeah, I think that one, and as well as several others in the area of workforce protections, worker protections, particularly the areas of occupational safety and health that we did. I came to the attention of a number of the longtime political appointees. Some people by that point had been in the Clinton administration at the Labor Department for 7 years, and so during the 4 years I was working for Rob Andrews, I was getting to know all of them, and we were working, as they would work with the people in the House of Representatives, to try to make sure that there was some support for the administration's position because the administration was facing a hostile Congress,
right.
And so because Rob was so well thought of as a really sharp debater, people would want to get him involved in things that the Clinton administration was trying to do. So I had a chance to meet a lot of people in the executive branch during my time with Rob, and they were constantly trying to recruit me. And so
they finally did.
So yeah, by the time 1990, and obviously I was very loyal to Rob, and we were doing a lot of exciting things. And sort of rebuilding after that 1997 primary, his platform and his profile in the House. But by the end of 1999, it was an opportunity that I wanted to seize. So that's where I was. That's what I was working on.
Well, and at the end of 2000, things did not go the Gore campaign's way.
They didn't.
And at the beginning of 2001, you must have been out looking for something.
I was, but beforehand, as my first opportunity to meet then Senator John Corzine. In his first couple of weeks as U.S. Senator, he made a point to call over to all of the folks from the Clinton administration, from various departments he was interested in, to ask them if they would come over and give him briefings on what they'd been working on, what the issues were that he, as a senator now facing a change of parties in the executive branch, might want to look out for. And be watchful for things that might get overturned or reversed or otherwise, bad ideas that might be coming up. And so my boss was kind enough to say, "Oh, you're from Jersey. You go brief this new freshman senator." So I got to do that. I spent an hour and a half with him and his then legislative director in the basement of the Dirksen building, because new senators get these temporary spaces. And we sat in that little windowless room in the basement of the Senate building, talking about the issues for the labor department and labor area issues that would be, I thought, important for him to know about as a brand new senator. He asked great questions, and he was really engaged in the material. I left him a whole binder full of information, and I had a very favorable impression of.
But he didn't offer you a job.
He did not at that time offer me a job, although Tom Shea, when I later went to work for Governor Corzine, Tom Shea said, you know, well, we wanted to recruit you, so I guess I must have missed the signal. But in any event, I actually at that point already had a job offer in hand to go join one of my administration colleagues who was then becoming the legislative director for the AFL-CIO.
Ah.
And he hired me to be a legislative representative for the national AFL-CIO.
Is legislative representative a euphemism for lobbyist?
Yeah, I was a lobbyist. I was up there on the Hill talking to staff of Congress members about the priorities of the labor movement at a time when there was a brand new George W. Bush administration with a whole bunch of new ideas and an all-Republican Congress majority, both houses. And so it was certainly a time of playing a lot of defense. One of the major issues that was coming up at the time was the Bush administration was proposing essentially to eliminate the federal role in unemployment insurance, which had been around since the Social Security Act from the 1930s. They were proposing to get rid of that, and there was a concerted effort to stop that, which actually foreshadowed 4 years later when President Bush was trying to get rid of Social Security altogether through privatization of Social Security, which that also was stopped. But
right.
So there was, that was that and some other issues were sort of, I was the point person on for the national labor movement. We bring together all the different constituent labor unions from all the different types of industries and get a group to get together and go talk to individual members of Congress and their staffs about those issues.
And then you came back to New Jersey.
Yes. So while I was at the AFL-CIO, there was another governor's race at this point in 01. During that summer, their policy staff contacted the AFL-CIO and asked for briefings and advice and memos and help writing speeches. The candidate, then State Senator McGreevey and Mayor McGreevey, was giving speeches to national labor groups and wanted help. So I would send ideas. Again, my boss has said, "You're from New Jersey, you should help this guy out." So that's what I did, and that was very helpful.
And no hard feelings about the fact that you had worked for his
Not at all.
opponent in the 77.
I never heard one word about that from the McGreevey people. They were extremely gracious and happy to have the help, and I think I provided useful advice. When people needed something fast, I was able to turn around, written products and talking points that people could use quickly. So
after McGreevey won in 2001, in 2002, were you recruited to come back?
I was, and they asked me if I'd like to join the Labor Department in the new administration in Trenton, and I jumped at the chance. One of the issues I've been working on was unemployment insurance, so they asked me to run the unemployment insurance program, which is the largest program within the state labor department, and that we did a number of reforms there. But I was able to have an executive leadership job for the first time. I mean, running a congressional office of 18 people is really nothing like running a division of state government of 1,000 people.
Well, it's also it's also being in the real bowels of the executive branch as opposed to the legislative branch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was a really great experience.
Now, you're in that position through a succession of labor commissioners because of the change of administration from McGreevey to Cody.
Yep.
And now, 2005, John Corzine is elected governor. You're still in that position.
Yep.
Somehow, I guess by January 2006, when he is inaugurated, you have become the acting commissioner.
Yeah, it's a funny story. I really loved what I had been doing. As you said, I worked for 4 different labor commissioners over those 4 years, and 2 different governors. And so I was excited for the new administration, and I reached out to people that I knew on the transition team volunteered to help out in any way I could. The position I was seeking, the promotion that I was seeking from unemployment insurance director, was to be the deputy commissioner, to be the COO, the person who helps the commissioner run the department, the real number 2 person at the department. And they had a series of people with great political connections and sort of high-profile individuals that were being considered in series during the November to January transition 10-week period. I think 4 in total that they asked me to give briefings to. So I had a whole binder full of ideas because I was helping write the transition memo from the outgoing Cody administration to the incoming Corzine administration.
Which I should point out for viewers or readers of the transcript is a common activity that takes place during any transition, even if it's within the same political party.
Right, exactly. And so the putting together those memos and those lists, at that time the final labor commissioner for Cody was A.J. Sabbath, and so he tasked me with doing a lot of that because he knew that I was interested in policy, and so I was working on that and providing those suggestions to these people who were being considered by Governor-elect Corzine's transition team as possible labor commissioners. And
Did you know who those people were?
Oh yeah, no, I went and met with individually met with them and gave them, in one case, a 3-hour-long conversation, in another case, sort of an hour briefing, a bunch of different conversations with people who were under strong consideration. I was told were imminently about to be named, and of course I was hoping also to impress them so that they would be happy with the idea of me as the deputy commissioner, that we could build a working relationship before the administration even started. And one by one, each of them was blocked by one faction or another in the Democratic Party. And so they got to the night before the inauguration and they still didn't have a person in mind for labor commissioner. So I got a call, said, would you mind being acting commissioner?
I can relate to that. I had almost exactly the same thing happen to me at the Department of Environmental Protection.
So, no, exactly. They said, well, would you, listen, would you mind doing this? No, you're nobody objects to you. Right. You're sort of this neutral technocrat. Why don't you do this? And so
was there a deputy commissioner at that point who might have been approached to do that, or were you really the highest ranking remaining person on the staff?
There really wasn't somebody else who would have made sense to do that. There was nobody there that had been sort of connected to New Jersey Democratic politics. There were a number of people who were real career, long-time government servants who were career, had been there not as political appointees.
Right.
So
was your title assistant commissioner? Or
no, my title was director of unemployment insurance.
Okay.
And so it was,
All right, so one by one, all of these others dropped out, and now you're the acting commissioner starting on day 1 of the Corzine administration.
Indeed.
And for the next 6 months, you're the acting commissioner.
Yeah. And because I had spent so much time really thinking about what the day 1 agenda for labor should be and sort of thinking about what the governor-elect had campaigned on, but also working out some ideas about what the department could be used for. I had spent 4 years inside that department thinking about what we could do better. I actually had something of a day 1 agenda. I had a bunch of things to work on and got to work on those. And eventually, after about 5 months, it was at the AFL-CIO conference in mid-June of 2006 that the governor actually announced that he was going to send my name to the Senate to do the job permanently.
That, in fact, was in June of 2006. How much advance notice did you have that he was going to make this announcement?
Well, the fact that he was making it that day, I had about 6 hours advance notice. The fact that it was eventually going to happen, I was fairly confident of. I mean, I guess I viewed it as a tryout, but I also thought it was sort of mine to lose.
If Tom Shea, who was Corzine's chief of staff, has since told you that they wanted to recruit you 4 years earlier, why weren't you just immediately appointed to that position?
I think because they did want me to get better known among stakeholders and constituency groups. I mean, I was essentially a complete unknown. I mean, I think people in policy circles might have known who I was, but certainly people in the labor movement didn't know who I was. People in other stakeholders that care a lot, some of the activist and advocacy groups that care a lot about the work of the Labor Department, unless they had been working on unemployment insurance with me for the last 4 years, they didn't have any idea who I was.
But your interests, based upon your experience, went far beyond unemployment insurance.
Exactly, and I had worked before on some worker protection issues on minimum wage, and had worked at the Labor Department. At the U.S. Labor Department, worked on really the whole gamut: job training, workforce development, all of that. And so, because of that, I sort of, as I say, I had a sense of the panoply. The Labor Department is really many different things.
Well, that was actually my next question.
Yeah.
I mean, some of us are old enough to remember the New Jersey Department of Labor and Industry,
Right.
which I think subsequently the Commerce and Economic Development was spun off,
Right.
became a separate department. It then became the Department of Labor, and at some point it became the Department of Labor and Workforce Development.
Right.
What describe briefly?
Yeah.
Sort of what is the gamut of programs that the Labor Department is responsible for? What are its primary missions?
So, its primary missions is to help workers succeed in the economy, but there are three prongs to get that done. So the Labor Department protects workers on the job. It's obviously got wage enforcement, the whole concept of workers being treated fairly by their employers and not shorted on their wages, not shorted on all of the other things that they should get. And also protected in terms of occupational safety and health. So there's a whole slew of worker protections.
So OSHA enforcement comes under labor?
In New Jersey we have enforcement of PIOSH, that is Public Employee Safety and Occupational Safety and Health. So there's lots and lots of public employees who are working very dangerous jobs.
And what about private employment?
Private employment is done by the federal OSHA, Federal Department of Labor. However, so I had worked on that in my prior life, but it's certainly analogous to what we do for the public employees. And in addition, there's some cooperative agreements with the Federal Department of Labor where the state Labor Department goes out, for instance, and tries to educate employers on how to do a better job, so compliance assistance.
Right.
So there actually is a role for the state even in that, although it's not in enforcement. So there's the labor standards. Then the second major piece of the department is social insurance in various forms, unemployment insurance being one of them, but also disability insurance and other workers' compensation. And so there's social insurance, which is all about when people are unable to work, giving them some form of temporary wage replacement that helps them tide over so that we don't lose an educated workforce that spirals into total destitution when something interrupts their ability to earn wages. So social insurance is another major piece of what the department is about. And then the third piece is job training, workforce development. It's so important that it was added to the actual name of the department because so much depends on not only retaining that educated workforce and protecting them, but actually training them up and always responding to the needs of the economy, the needs of employers who are seeking workers who know new things and have the ability to get lifelong learning and training.
So retraining people from the manufacturing economy to the service economy is a major component.
To the information economy, and also training people who are in that economy, but what the skills they have become outdated. So the training of so-called incumbent workers, customized training of people who have jobs but need skills upgrades is a big piece of it. In addition to that, the training of people who are unemployed, who have disabilities, who are otherwise facing barriers to employment, like people who are on public assistance or returning from prison or any of the other major social issues that confront people when they're trying to get into the labor market and labor force, and there's a barrier. And so the Labor Department helps break down those barriers and helps pay for job training that people need.
One of your predecessors as Labor Commissioner, Ray Bramucci,
once of blessed memory.
Of blessed memory, indeed. Once described how he felt as a cabinet officer as being like a mushroom, sitting around doing nothing, or not having much attention or interest paid to what he did.
Oh, well, you've cleaned it up.
Yeah, I have. How high on the radar, how prominent on the radar screen was this set of issues to John Corzine, governor?
In the first 2 years, pretty middle to low on the radar screen. We worked hard to get the issues related to job training folded into the broader agenda that the governor talked about all the time relative to economic growth. So I worked very hard, and this is one of the main things that we spent the first couple of years on, aligning our interest in job training and the economy with the economic growth plan. The economic growth plan, for instance, had specific industry targets, clusters that we wanted to invest in because we had the best opportunity as a competitive advantage for New Jersey against other states. And so we tried to target our funding in that way. So that was related. The other thing that was a through line, some of the governor's interests in social justice, there was certainly great interest in the social insurance expansion of paid family leave.
Right.
And so that was at our department. It was we actually built it into an existing temporary disability program that was for people taking time off from work because of their own illness or injury. And we said, let's add to that a social insurance benefit for people taking time off for work to care for a loved one with an illness or injury, like a parent or a child or a spouse. And that was one of the governor's, that was something he had worked on as a U.S. Senator. It was one of his top agenda items as governor, and we spent all 4 years, well, 3 out of the 4 years getting that passed, and then the final year getting it ready to be implemented.
Now, for most of the first 2 years, it seems to me you were probably in a position where in 2006, the governor proposed a budget that eliminated 1,000 state jobs.
Right.
In 2007, he proposed one that eliminated 3,000 state jobs.
Right.
And froze state payrolls
Right.
and benefits and so forth. How did you handle the situation where clearly you had to come in with a budget that showed cutting costs, cutting people
Right.
on the payroll? How'd you deal with that?
Well, it was certainly, it was part of all of our roles. The Department of Labor is a little unique in that it's almost 90% funded off the state budget. Almost every major program at the Department of Labor is either funded with federal administrative dollars, which are specifically to hire staff to administer programs that the feds ask the states to administer, including unemployment insurance and job training. It's all 100% federal money, or trust fund money. So the temporary disability insurance program has its own separate dedicated payroll tax that goes into a trust fund that's off budget.
And that's money that's paid into by
workers
and employees. Right?
Yeah, workers and employers pay in you see it right on your pay stub. If you ever notice TDI or FLI in a New Jersey pay stub, that's what that's for. And that's going mostly to the benefits, but a little bit of it goes to the administration of the program, which pays for those staff. And so we were always, getting exemptions from those various cuts because you don't save the state budget any money by cutting Labor Department staff, except for a very small number of people who work.
Did you have to do layoffs?
We did. Well, not layoffs, but we took attrition. We didn't backfill people as they left, and we definitely slimmed down the total headcount of the department in those first couple of years. But we weren't doing massive cuts of actual layoffs of people because it wasn't really necessary. Our budget was such a tiny piece of the state budget from just the state budget standpoint. I think we had, from an administration standpoint, we had a $700 million admin budget. But
It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket.
No, but only 30 million of that shows up on the state budget. So it's like nothing.
Right.
But then I will say, in the second 2 years of the administration, the issues relative to the labor market, because we had the crash and the Great Recession, really suddenly a lot of the things we were working on became considerably more salient.
Well, even before that, a few months before the Great Recession hit, the unemployment insurance fund was running out of money. And the governor called for an emergency $260 million to avoid triggering a $350 million tax increase for employers. Explain what that meant. How does that come about?
Sure. So for 14 years before Governor Corzine took office, the governors and the legislatures had been building their budget with smoke and mirrors, or with one-shots, with a non-recurring revenue. And one of the things that they were doing was raiding the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. That is, by actually lowering the unemployment insurance tax and then adding a new payroll tax for a state purpose, in this case state charity care, but it could have been any state money, on top, so that the employer and workers were still paying the same taxes, but less of it was going into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. It was called a diversion. And those diversions soaked huge amounts of money out of the trust fund such that it was not ready, not prepared for a recession. When we took office in January of '06, we realized that this had been going on too long. And the governor's first budget was the first budget in 14 years to propose no diversion from the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. And all 4 of his years of his budgets didn't to take any money out of the trust fund. First governor to do that of either party in 14 years. And that was intended to try to repair the trust fund's solvency to get ready for the next recession, so we'd be able to pay benefits to unemployed people in times of crisis. Unfortunately, the recession came too soon. We had a couple of years in which we were modestly repairing that solvency, but it was too late. By the time the economy started turning down, we actually had an early warning. Unemployment insurance was a canary in the coal mine. We started seeing in late '07, unemployment insurance claims started going up. We started seeing the economy weakening. And it was clear by December of '07 that we were heading for trouble. And because there was so little money in the trust fund, the way taxes are determined is that when a balance goes down below a certain level, it triggers an automatic tax increase on employers, because the whole purpose of unemployment insurance is to keep that fund balance healthy enough to pay benefits.
Why just the employers? Why not employers and employees, both of whom contribute to the unemployment insurance
So the
fund?
employee, the way our state law works is the employee amount is fixed, and then the employer amount is variable. It's actually variable on several different fronts. So it's variable on each individual employer's experience, so that there's a little bit of a disincentive to laying people off, because your taxes go up if you lay off a whole lot more people. And so employers should feel some amount of risk about laying off, or at least think twice that if they're going to lay a whole bunch of people off, they are going to somewhat pay for that impact onto the unemployment insurance program.
Now, who's responsible for flagging what you described as happening in 2007? Does that come under the Department of Labor and the unemployment insurance people, or is it the Treasury that's looking and seeing that number?
No, that's our fund. We're the ones doing the numbers every week, and reporting to the governor's office and to the treasurer every month, and to the legislature when they asked us. But mostly we're talking to the executive branch and raising the alarm and saying, this is going to be an issue. There's going to be an automatic tax increase that no legislation could stop. Rather than have that happen, one option we had was to put state money into the trust fund, state general fund money.
And this is through an emergency appropriation?
Right, which had never been...
Or simply a transfer?
We added it into a legislative vehicle. I think we put it in the budget, actually. But I don't recall exactly how we got it done, but we ultimately put extra money in there to try to forestall the tax increase, not thinking that maybe this recession that was starting was going to be a mild recession. We did a bunch of models on the type of recession and how much of an impact we would have. Now, I had been unemployment insurance director during the '02 aftermath of the '01 recession, which was, we had a mild recession from 2001 to 2002. And so and there was another mild recession, slightly worse recession in the 1991 timeframe. And so there was a bunch of experience of what happens to unemployment insurance claims, how many more New Jerseyans lose their jobs, and how much more money we have to pay out. And we sort of thought we could model that. No one was prepared for the depths of the Great Recession. Right. It was 3 times worse than our worst case scenario model.
Unemployment get to what, 9.7, 9.8%?
It did, and the number of people claiming unemployment insurance on a weekly basis tripled. It went from 125,000 to 475,000 in a matter of 6 months. It was just, it was
and did both the federal and state
slope.
stimulus money end up helping to resolve that?
Not really. What it ended up doing was giving unemployed workers more weeks of unemployment insurance because people were routinely running out of the maximum that the state provides, which is 6 months of unemployment insurance. And in the summer of '08, I was labor commissioner at the time. A whole bunch of state labor commissioners of both parties went to Washington. We did an event that the National Governors Association put on, calling on Congress and the Bush administration to put more extended benefits into place because people needed more time to look for work at a time when there were no jobs.
And this is still a month or two before the Great Recession really hit in September, October.
It got significantly worse in mid-September. Certainly, the Wall Street crashed in mid-September, and there was. But in the summer of '08, I mean, this is what I'm saying. From an unemployment insurance standpoint, from a workers losing their job standpoint, we were already in the teeth of a recession. Now again, we were modeling that it would be, oh, well, maybe it'll be a little worse than the one we'd had a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And of course, it then took a turn even for the worse in...
Backtrack a year earlier when you're beginning to wave that red flag of what might happen to the unemployment insurance fund. In April of 2007, the governor is involved in a near fatal automobile accident.
Indeed, yeah.
How did that affect the cabinet? How did it affect the day-to-day operations of state government and your department in particular?
Well, I don't know about the day-to-day operations. We were all very worried about Governor Corzine. I mean, I think every single one of us had enormous affection for him personally. We were very worried about him and worried about his recovery. There wasn't a lot of information about when he'd be coming back. And we had things that were put on hold. I know we did a number of projects on improving our worker protection, our enforcement of prevailing wage laws. I had been a piece of legislation that we'd been working on that was an administration initiative. That there were little cleanup bills that we worked on and a number of really good pieces of legislation that had gotten through and that we were all slated to have a press conference for the governor to sign them, and then in the end that didn't happen. Or I guess one of them we had done with a signing by the acting governor, Richard Cody, and so it was just a constant question about should we change any of our direction. We just kept rolling with what we were working on, but it was definitely a time of concern and worry.
Mm-hmm. But in speaking with other cabinet officers and people involved in the administration, it seemed as though that things sort of worked fairly seamlessly. I mean, some folks say because Dick Cody had been the acting governor and could sort of step right in and perform that role, it was kind of seamless. Senator Cody himself, Governor Cody, we should call him now, to a certain extent contests that assessment in an interview right here at Eagleton. In fact, talked about some difficulties that he had during that transition, during that period.
Okay.
But you raise your eyebrows as if that may come as a surprise to you.
Yeah, I didn't see those difficulties. So I mean, some of that was presumably being talked about in the front office. I know that he was extremely gracious to me. We were involved in getting ready for the budget hearings, and so we had to do our regular job of sort of submitting how we were going to explain the budget that we had submitted to the legislature and how we would deal with the Q&A. And that stuff does, in fact, then you have one of the members of the legislature sitting as your acting governor. So that actually, I think, was an advantage, at least for the purposes of the basic thing that a cabinet member does in the spring, which is defends his or her budget to the legislature. Having not only your governor's office, front office staff give you advice on that back and forth and respond to your draft answers, Q's and A's, but having some advice from some of the Cody people, it was really, I thought it was pretty seamless. Certainly, it was, we had a very cooperative relationship between Senate majority staff, front office staff, and cabinet members. We always felt like we were all allies.
In June of 2007, I guess Governor Corzine had recovered enough so that at the state AFL-CIO convention, same place that he had announced his appointment of you a year earlier, said that he wanted the legislature to pass a paid family leave bill by the end of the month. He was still pushing it in November of that year,
right?
And he finally signed it in May 2008.
Indeed.
Explain what that bill was all about. I mean, this is obviously he considers it a major accomplishment of the administration.
Yeah.
It was clearly a Labor Department issue.
Yep.
So walk us through that, if you would.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and I want to say it is one of the real legacies of Governor Corzine's administration. It is a tremendous success and one that I am so honored to have been able to be a part of getting done. In 1993, President Clinton signed a law at the national level providing unpaid family and medical leave, so that if you had a family crisis or your own medical crisis, you could take time off from work if you worked for a large enough company. So it only applied to people working for large companies, 50 or more people, and you would be guaranteed your job back after a certain number of weeks. And while that was helpful to some people, certainly someone whose mother is in the hospital going through a crisis, their child is sick, their spouse or they themselves need medical leave to be able to be with that family member. If you don't have the money to self-fund that, to give up that income for 12 weeks or something, or 10 weeks or 6 weeks, that's really cold comfort. Yes, you get your job back, but in the meanwhile, you've lost a couple months of income. And so for most low and moderate income people, that was a false promise. And so for years since then, people in the labor field and others had been talking about, we really need to make this a social insurance benefit like workers' comp that pays you while you're out due to a work-related injury, like unemployment insurance that pays you while you're out of work due to a job you lost through no fault of your own. We should treat this in that same way of social insurance. And let's give people a cash benefit worth some percentage of their wages so that they don't lose everything if they are forced with this impossible choice of being with their family member during this time of crisis or working. And so this enables you to take that time off work and have some money coming in temporarily. We have in New Jersey, and have had for 60 years, temporary disability insurance for your own disability. You break your leg, you need a few weeks to recover, you have to be out from work. You don't get all of your wages, but you get
that's the TDI.
That's TDI, it's been around for forever, since 1948. But we don't have it if you're caring for a family member. So what the governor was proposing was, let's add to the TDI program an FLI program, family leave insurance, to go along with temporary disability insurance, that would do the same thing, follow the same schedule. If you've got information from a physician that you have someone in your family that is going through this medical crisis and you need to be with them to provide comfort and care and be there, your child, your spouse, your parents.
Was this also to apply to large employers or to all employers?
No, TDI applies to every employer employer that pays wages. I mean, obviously it applies to employees who are being paid wages on a payroll, which is 97% of the people in the economy. So the idea was that it would apply the same way. But of course, because there was this other law about unpaid leave, that exact question is what the legislature and other activist groups and others were constantly asking about is maybe we should only restrict this to some workers.
I'm sure that small businesses felt that way.
Small businesses felt that way, although not all. Many small businesses testified about how they would like to not lose their workers. They couldn't afford to pay them wages when they weren't there.
So a state-backed insurance plan would be preferable.
Exactly. It's a way to retain your qualified employees without you footing the bill. This is, by the way, paid for with payroll taxes that are paid for essentially by the employees themselves out of income that they don't get.
Is it a matching employer-employee?
No, it's all 100% employee.
Oh.
And it's, although, if you ask economists, they will say even when an employer pays a payroll tax, it ultimately comes out of the workers' compensation. So it's all paid by the employee. But that's an esoteric academic question. But in any event, the amount, because you're spreading the risk over the pool of all 4.5 million people who work for wages in the state of New Jersey, and most of them don't experience one of these events any given year, you're able to charge people $20 a year in a payroll tax. They don't even notice it in 52 weeks of pay. It's a few pennies a week. And then you have a fund that's enough to pay a modest level of benefits. That argument, however, took a long time. We had a lot of debate, a lot of questions from members of both parties in the legislature. We had support from a couple members in the Republican Party. We had opposition from several members in the Democratic Party. We never knew that we were going to get the votes. We obviously did not go up on for a vote until they secured the votes, the minimum number of votes needed to pass it. It was a very, very dicey situation. I think I testified before the legislature 4 different times over the space of that year you just described.
Were you the point person on this?
Well, the point people were me, because we would be administering the program, and then the governor's policy team, led by Heather Howard and Julie Cashin in the governor's office. So we worked hand in glove together. And I had known Julie Cashin when she had worked for Senator Ted Kennedy when I was in Washington, and so.
Had you known Heather when she worked for?
I had not known. I met Heather when I joined the Corzine cabinet.
Yeah. So you finally got it passed, and then comes 2009 and the re-election campaign. Throughout 2009, well, first of all, throughout most of 2009, you're dealing with an egregious financial situation. And you're dealing with the unknowns of an upcoming election.
Yep.
The first polls show Christie well with the lead. The next polls show it much closer. And there's a poll showing Corzine in the lead. So you're bouncing back and forth, and you must be thinking to yourself, am I going to have this job for another 4 years, or am I going to be out pounding the pavement in December of 2009? Tell me what it's like. Well, I mean, I have the same experience personally, but tell me what your experience was like those last few months of the campaign, sort of, on the one hand, dealing with the issues that you had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but on the other hand, having to think at least a little bit about what was going to happen after the election. I'm a relentless optimist. I was spending my time. So was I.
I was spending my time, and also I was viewing all of this through the lens of recovery from the Great Recession. And President Obama took office in January of 2009, and the Congress quickly passed this Recovery Act, and we had the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, or whatever ARRA stands for. And we had a lot of things in there that were tools we could use, additional funding, to try to help people through the labor market impacts of the Great Recession. Because labor markets continue to be bad well after the recession technically ends and the recovery had started. And so I was spending my time on a variety of, I know in that fall, we did a return to work initiative that we made a big splash about, and we did a press conference with the governor about. to try to give employers an incentive, financial incentive, to hire people who had been unemployed for a long time. We were working on green jobs and sort of looking for, the investments that were being made in the green economy in various ways that were supposed to come with the opportunity for new employment as a result of those investments. Mm-hmm. And what could we find that we could train people for that would meet the jobs that were being created. We were constantly pouring through the labor market information, looking for evidence that we were turning the corner, looking for those so-called green shoots, as the chairman of the Federal Reserve gave a speech, I think in the spring of '09, saying we're beginning to see green shoots, we're beginning to see the very beginnings of spring, of the recovery coming back from the ashes. And we kept looking for those and talking to employers and talking to workers about where they were seeing opportunities coming, you never get a pure signal. First of all, labor market data is always a few weeks or months out of date. And second of all, there's noise in the data. And so picking the signal out from the noise is not easy. And so we were spending our time doing that. The last thing I was thinking about was whether John Corzine was going to get reelected or not. I was just assuming we should do everything we could to try to get this, this economy back to bright and try to help workers during this difficult period of time. And I figured that good government would be good politics, that if I was doing that in some small way, that would redound to his reputational benefit, and it might help the campaign. Mm-hmm. But it was really not, whether I was going to have a job in January of 2010, by that point I had been doing this I'd been in the state labor department for nearly 8 years. Right. I'd been commissioner for nearly 4 years. So I wasn't sure I was going to be sticking around much longer anyway. I sort of thought I had done my bit. I was on my post because I wanted to try to get through the recession. I wanted to try to improve our economy or improve our labor market using the tools that we did have for as long as I could.
So November 2009, you don't get the immediate word, but you certainly had to have the feeling that the amount of time you had to do that was going to be very limited. Yeah. And probably end in early January of 2010.
Yeah, I testified at a Senate Labor Committee hearing maybe in December, or maybe late November actually, before Thanksgiving. And someone one of the journalists wrote about it and said, boy, that sounded like a valedictory, because I said, it's been a pleasure working with you. I basically was saying goodbye, because I knew I wasn't going to be around for very much longer.
How was the transition to the Christie group?
It was very disappointing. I knew a lot of the people on the Labor Department team that was coming in to understand the Labor Department. Because I had had such a good experience with getting information from the DeFrancesco people when I was helping out in '01, and myself helping out with the transition to Corzine in '05, I sort of expected the same level, and so I made sure that our team was putting together as much transparent and helpful information and offered up the chance to brief them and give them ideas, and they didn't want to hear anything. They never wanted to meet with any of our people. They just came in and did whatever they wanted to do. Mm-hmm.
Did you meet with your successor at any point, or were you out the door before that?
No, they didn't name my successor until after my last day. We did leave in place our CFO, a wonderful, wonderful, long-time career employee at the department. George Krause was left in as the, did you know George?
I know the name, I'm not sure.
Yeah, George Krause was probably at the department for 30-some years and had been a CFO for many commissioners and was really a class act. And I think he joined government at the beginning of the Kane administration, and so he was respected by a lot of people on the Republican side, so they asked him to be acting commissioner, at least for a few days. Mm-hmm. I later did get to meet my successor at some function or other, and we actually sat down and had lunch. We had a nice conversation, but no, at the time, that wasn't part of the deal.
All right, so you spent the next 8 years in the wilderness. Before we get to what you're doing now, which is back in state government again.
Indeed.
Let's talk a little bit about that wilderness, those 8 years of the Christie administration. What did you do?
Yeah, it wasn't the wilderness, but I did go away from New Jersey state government and politics. That's the way in which it was the wilderness. I actually had a wonderful time in two very different but very exciting jobs. I went to work for a company called Pinnacle Foods, which was a portfolio company of Blackstone. It was owned by private equity with the goal of growing and ultimately going public. And the CEO, the brand new CEO, started in late '09, and in early 2010, I had known him from his prior job. He asked me if I would come help them get ready to go public by sort of creating a new role. I was called Vice President of Corporate Affairs, but what I was working on was sort of social, corporate social responsibility initiatives, ways to work on sustainability, ways to work on things that the company should do if it wanted to look more like a publicly traded food company. Some of the things that those type of companies have that this company, as a very small private company, didn't have.
This is a family-owned
No, it was essentially a company that had been a bankrupt Vlasic Foods pickle company that had been spun out of Campbell's Soup. So a New Jersey company that made Vlasic pickles, and that successive private equity owners had brought other brands together under the umbrella of Pinnacle Foods, so Duncan Hines, and when I got there we had just acquired Bird's Eye, frozen vegetables.
Also a New Jersey company.
Exactly, so a whole lot of different food brands. I mean, Pinnacle Foods, no one knew the corporate name, but everyone knew the brands. I mean, Log Cabin Syrup and, as I said, Duncan Hines, Bird's Eye, Vlasic, lots of different
This is a
brands.
brand new experience.
Totally new
for you.
experience. I had not done corporate America before. This was a growing company. I learned a whole lot. One of the other things I did, which was in my wheelhouse, was we had 14 manufacturing plants, some of which we had newly acquired when we acquired those new brands. So I went out and met with all those plant managers and worked with them on job training of their incumbent workforce. And I worked with them on how they could partner with their local community colleges and their local workforce development systems. So basically putting into practice at the company level the stuff that I'd been talking about in policy since back when I was working as a congressional aide.
How different did you find the private sector from what you had thought of it when you were in the public sector?
Well, I mean, that part of it where I was doing something where I actually had seen employers talk about how they trained their workforce, it was really very interesting to actually talk to a plant manager and say, what is it you need to get productivity up? What are you being measured on, and how do these workers look to you, and what is this job training input going to do to help your bottom line and make the company more money? I mean, essentially, there is the ability to measure the impact of everything, not on a whole bunch of metrics. In public policy, we're always looking at equity and opportunity and cost and all sorts of different metrics. There's only sort of one metric, right, which is the company going to net make money doing this? Is this worth doing for our long-term profitability? EBITDA, I just had not spent any time on what it takes to become profitable.
Yet your primary interest, it seems to me, in doing that sort of thing is doing well by doing good.
Yes, I certainly was a little bit different from most people in the corporate office.
I imagine so.
In terms of my basic motivations. That being said, I made great friends and learned a whole lot from them. And I think they valued my bringing a very strange and different perspective to those conversations.
Where was this job?
It was in Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
And we later built a larger office up in Parsippany, so I split my time between Cherry Hill and Parsippany. The plants, none of them were here.
Right.
The 14 manufacturing plants were all where the food is grown, so they were mostly in the South and Midwest. So one of them was in Delaware, where the cucumbers were grown for Vlasic pickles. So I've traveled a lot. Over those 4 years, and then in the third of those 4 years we went public. So we did a number of, with Bird's Eye, for instance, I did a partnership on healthy eating and vegetables with Michelle Obama that became a cause marketing initiative for that company. They would not have been able to make those relationships and make those connections without my understanding of what politicians think and what the brand wanted, right? Essentially, I was the glue between brand marketing people and what Michelle Obama was working on, which was trying to encourage healthy eating, nutrition, exactly. And so So I think I added value. I know I added value to that company, and it was really a remarkable experience. And then we went public, and the need for that startup wasn't as much there.
For people who may not know a piece of minutia of New Jersey history, Clarence Birdseye,
Right.
who created Birdseye Foods, and I think it's Charles Seabrook of Seabrook Farms
Right.
down in Cumberland County, were involved in some collaboration that created frozen foods.
Indeed.
And that's one of South Jersey's gifts to the world.
That's absolutely true.
So anyway,
there's a wonderful book, which we could cut this out, but there's a wonderful book by Mark Kurlansky about Clarence Birdseye, which he's the guy who wrote Salt. And he also wrote this book about about Birdseye and about how he discovered he went trapping with the Eskimos in Canada and learned about the flash freezing if something's cold enough when it's later thawed out, all of its property. Anyway, that really is a digression. Boy,
okay, from that experience, there's one more before you come back to state government.
Yeah, so I then saw an opportunity to apply for a job at a policy and advocacy organization working on workforce development and higher ed policy, specifically focused on creating opportunity for low-income people. It's a national organization called CLASP, which is the Center for Law and Social Policy. It's been around for 50 years, and they have a team called the Center for Post-Secondary and Economic Success, which is the workforce training and higher ed policy team. The director of that team had retired, so in April of 14, I think, the posting went up. I went and interviewed, and ultimately in the summer of 14, I went down and started that job and hired a bunch of policy analysts to work on those issues and really get back engaged in the world of national public policy.
Is this in Washington?
It was in Washington, D.C. It's a national group. I did commute down to D.C. and kept my family in my home here in New Jersey.
Right.
So, I was down there during the week, a few nights a week, and then would sort of be home during the.
So you were doing the Joe Biden commute.
I did a lot, or the commute I had done when I was an aide to the congressman.
Commute,
yes, so I mean, I sort of was naive enough to think that I could still do that. So I did that for 3.5 years, and
made Amtrak a lot of money.
I did. I have lots of Amtrak miles as a result. But that work really sort of re-engaged me in the conversations around reauthorizing the Higher Ed Act, reauthorizing the Workforce Investment Act, which became the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was the same set of issues I had been working on 2 decades earlier. So it was a coming home to those issues at a policy level.
It's interesting because I think most people would not recognize or think of, and I would be among them, the nexus between higher education and labor and workforce development.
It's interesting because, it's funny, because of the way Congress is set up, and it's in the same committee, you are right that in the policy world, the people who work on those issues are very niche and siloed, and most of them only work on higher ed or only work on job training. They're not the same people. But I had the experience early in my career of congressional offices don't have that luxury. You have to be a bit more of a generalist, especially when your boss is on the committee that does both of those major pieces of national landmark legislation. And you had to learn them both, and we were rewriting both of them in the same 2-year period in the mid-90s. And so I had that grounding, and I saw those connections. I saw it even more when I came at the Labor Department. One of the other members of the cabinet was the head of the Commission on Higher Ed, Jane Oates, and she had the same experience. She had worked for Ted Kennedy as his higher ed and workforce development person for 10 years, and before Corzine recruited her to come to Trenton. And she was over at the higher ed, but she and I were always collaborating on what can we do on all the forms of workforce training, running the gamut from short-term credential training all the way up to bachelor's degrees and beyond, and view it as a continuum related to the governor's economic growth strategy. So I've been in the field of where those intersections are for a quarter century now.
And which is sort of a natural segue to what you're doing now, which is the executive director of the New Jersey Higher Education Student Assistance Authority. Before we get into what that authority does and how it is how it bridges that nexus, Does one bridge a nexus? I'm not so sure. Maybe I'm mixing a lot of metaphors here. How did you come to this? Did Phil Murphy look and say, boy, Socolow would be a perfect person for that job, or were you involved in his campaign? How did you come to this position?
During the transition, I was still working at that Washington, D.C. Policy advocacy group, and we were very interested in state policy as a field of getting things done.
Well, this would particularly be so after the 2016 federal election.
Indeed. So here you are in the summer and early fall of 2017. Washington, D.C. federal policy seems like a not terribly good avenue for our advocacy efforts relative to helping low-income people succeed in the labor market with the current president. And so we thought we really should be looking more at how we can inform state policymakers. So I put together a briefing for the transition team with the help of Carl Van Horn here at Rutgers, who was advising Governor-elect Murphy.
And I should point out that workforce development, this whole set of issues we've been talking about has been part of Carl's portfolio for, 30, 40 years.
And Carl's been a mentor of mine for 24 years. So yeah, so I mean, I've stayed in touch with Carl in every job we've talked about, including the time when, I mean, I think Carl is one of the major reasons I got to be labor commissioner. And so he was number 2 with Dick Leone in terms of picking people for the Corzine cabinet. I'm sure he put a good word in for me at that time, or more than that. But then in this instance, we just did a transition briefing on a whole slew of issues. I wrote a couple of white papers about what might be done in higher ed policy for the state, the transition team asked me if I'd like to lead this new, if I would like to lead this agency.
How long has this agency been around?
Well, it's been around in some form or other since 1959. It's been around in its current iteration since 1999. There used to be one big department of higher ed.
Right.
Governor Christine Todd Whitman, through an executive order, dismantled that department 1994.
And made a commission instead.
Well, she made a little commission of higher ed to do some issues, another group of people to do issues related to financing facilities, buildings at schools, and then this agency, which had been the Office of Student Assistance, became its own separate independent authority called HESA, the Higher Ed Student Assistance Authority, which is the state's financial aid agency for people to help give people funds to help go to college, both merit scholarships as well as need-based scholarships, as well as help with college savings, the 529 plan, and college loans.
Jim Florio once said that one of his greatest accomplishments was a program called NJ Class.
Right.
I'm going to have to look it up here, the College Loans to Assist State Students program.
Yep.
That's one of the several programs that are in your bailiwick now. Would you describe some of the others?
Sure. So yeah, so NJ Class is a supplemental loan program. So everyone takes out the federal loans, which are capped for undergraduates, and then if they need supplemental loans, there's NJ Class.
This is specifically for in-state, for New Jersey students and New Jersey institutions.
New Jersey Nexus. They can actually take, if they're New Jersey residents, they can take them to schools out of state. But they also are used for people who don't live here going to a New Jersey institution. The other major things, as I mentioned, is the tuition aid grant, which is New Jersey's historic commitment to helping low-income students. It's 1/3 of all undergraduates at colleges in the state, and this is only for colleges and universities undergraduate in the state. And it's as I say, it's low and moderate income, 1/3 of all undergraduates. We provide them financial assistance, financial aid, similar to the federal Pell Grant, but on top of that, so that between the two of them, it's a part of helping make college more affordable.
Where does the money come from?
That's from the general fund. That's actually, so actually compared to when I was at the Labor Department, when I had almost no general fund in my budget, this program is entirely funded through the general fund. It's a $440 million line item in a $38 billion budget. It's actually a pretty large program that legislators have heard of it, right? They actually know what you're talking about when you say tag.
So when you go to, when it comes budget time,
Yep.
you actually do have to go and justify the amount of money that you're requesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I've now had this job through 2 budget seasons. I started a year and a half ago, and so I've done the budget testimony for both Senate and Assembly budget committees now 4 times, and there's a lot of spirit of dialogue about what should we be doing with this investment. Are we keeping pace with the ever-increasing cost of tuition? This is one of the most salient issues. The current governor has made this issue of college affordability and access really at the top of his economic development strategy. So I'm very happy to be sort of in the mix.
It's a major move nationally. Certainly many of the Democratic candidates for president are talking about making public colleges free.
Yes.
Is there a similar movement for this to happen in New Jersey?
There is. With this governor, Governor Murphy, under this current budget, the one that is about to end.
Their mayor.
No, FY19.
Okay.
His first budget included a.
I was going to say the one he's about to veto, but
no. The 2019 budget, which was his first budget, we worked together on an initiative to make 2 years of community college free, tuition free. Given the amount of funding we had, we restricted that to people whose family incomes were $45,000 and less, so low and moderate income. But his vision is, as you've discussed in the national context, to make community college tuition free. And so we are getting there incrementally through this first pilot, which we ran for 1 semester, the spring of 19, and he's proposed an expansion of that in the FY20 budget, which is at the moment of this taping,
right.
Still up in the air.
May or may not be
still up in the air, yeah.
I know you're not a member of the cabinet in this position,
Correct.
so this may be a difficult question for you to answer, but would you be able to, have you had enough meetings with Governor Murphy to be able to compare or contrast his management style with that of Governor Corzine?
It's hard to tell. I think that there are such different times, and as you say, my role is considerably different. I don't go to cabinet meetings in this job. I did before. I was certainly. I don't think I was as much of a mushroom as my predecessor, Commissioner Bramucci, described. I really was able to talk a lot to the people in the front office and to the governor personally. When I worked for Corzine. That's not something that's part of my role. I'm working very much with some of his staff members. I work, but I don't really work with the governor personally directly more than 2 or 3 times. We did a number of pieces of legislation. He did a bill signing press conference, which he spoke at and I spoke at, and I got to brief him beforehand. And so I've had some interaction with him, but not to know his management style. Yeah.
Well, describe, if you would, from your bases in the cabinet, of what Corzine's management style was like. How do you remember your interactions with him?
So I remember so the ones that are most memorable are the ones when he would call me up on my cell phone, usually when I was going from some place to some other place, because it's never a convenient time, and fire off a bunch of very specific questions, often not predicated on an immediate need, right? I mean, sometimes he would call me, he was about to give a speech, and he was asking, hey, David, could you remind me about this that we did or that we, and those were easy. But oftentimes he was really just engaged in, I understand this is going on, I want to know more about it. He had seen something we had written or put out, or written internally as a memo, and he was asking follow-up questions that were incredibly precise and thoughtful. And so I found that really interesting, right? Because it wasn't sort of a the staff memo, the way people describe the White House, and certainly I experienced a little bit of this sending memos to the White House when I worked in the Clinton administration, where it goes through 18 different layers and there's all of this vetting, and before something ever gets to the principal, 30,000 people. He would just pick up the phone, and I found that very, very refreshing. We also spoke every single month about the unemployment numbers for all 4 years. He was very interested in what those tables were showing, first when the economy was good, and then different questions when the economy was getting worse. But he was interested in those before. He was interested in those because they were really interesting. He's a numbers guy. And that's, I think, something that he and I have in common, that we really like to look at data and try to understand what story it's telling about human lives. And
was he a memo reader?
Yeah, I think he must have been, because I would write these various memos and then he would call and ask a bunch of questions. I don't know whether he was responding to the memos or responding to a briefing he got on the memos from one of his senior staff in the front office. That I don't know. But he certainly was a detail-oriented person.
With the benefit of hindsight now,
Yeah.
having had positions, both a cabinet position and now an authority position, what didn't you know when you started those jobs that now, with the benefit of experience and wisdom, you would be able to impart to other people?
So I would say the relationship with the legislature is, it's different. It's not exactly certainly people coming from Washington, D.C., which was the case a lot in the Corzine world, because he did bring a significant number of people with some expertise, and also people from his own Senate office. The relationship between the legislative and executive branch in D.C. isn't really the same. It is not an analogous thing. A lot of the forms look the same, but it's not. It's a much more personal, much more local relationship with these legislators. You don't have the same sort of staff mediation that you have. Legislators expect to talk to the governor personally, which means you're often talking to them and then they're going to talk directly to the governor about the conversation you've had. That's important to understand. That's certainly not happening in Washington.
One of the criticisms of the Corzine administration, or of Governor Corzine himself, I should say, is that he wasn't a New Jersey guy. He, in fact, came from that Washington mentality, brought with him a number of staff from Washington who did not have experience in New Jersey, and that a lot of legislators bristled at the fact that they didn't feel as though he took them seriously, or that they had a co-equal position. I mean, it seems as though history repeats itself, because that seems to be exactly the situation with Governor Murphy, who has a very similar background to Governor Corzine. Is that a legitimate criticism?
I don't think it's that legitimate a criticism. I think that it was something that, I mean, the degree of involvement and working together with the legislature in the Corzine administration, especially in those first couple of years when we were just kind of getting things started and up and running, I think was very good. I think that, I mean, there's other criticisms that have been made about the way the governor interacts with people about a decision where there's not always clear what decision had gotten made in a meeting that was meant to make a decision. That style, which existed for outside advocacy groups, it existed for legislators, it existed for his own team, I think was the same no matter which group you're talking about. So I think that's the management style, or not really a management style, it's a personal style about Governor Corzine that everyone had to get used to. And I think that he actually began to understand the need for directness and clarity. That's the Jersey issue, right? That he's Midwestern and he's a really nice person and didn't cut through with sharp declarative yeses and nos all the time in a more Jersey style way. I'm trying to be polite, but you know what I'm saying.
I know exactly what you're saying.
And I think that a lot of people might have been frustrated by that. But in terms of communicating with the legislature, it's a lot of communication. And I think that from a cabinet member's perspective, there's the desire to all be part of a team and have only one channel of communication and not have back channels and not have cabinet members go rogue and have their own relationships with the legislature. And that's an obvious desire of every front office, and it's the right instinct, right? You don't want multiple voices speaking for the administration. On the other hand, you've got to build those relationships. you've got, as a cabinet member, to actually know the legislators that are interested in your issue areas. The committee members of the committee that cares about your issues or works on your issues, the appropriations and budget committee members that are going to work on your budget, and some of the others. And you don't have to know the entire legislature, and you don't have to know everything that the front office is doing. You're aware that you're only working on one itty little bitty piece of what the administration's agenda is. And so the ability to sort of simultaneously keep the front office informed about what conversations you're having, but not be sort of an impenetrable brick wall that won't talk to legislators because you need to get approval to say anything substantive. There's a fine line there. You've got to walk a line between those two, and that having an understanding about that up front, having a relationship with the governor's office people when you're running one of these cabinet agencies, because one of the reasons you have cabinet agencies that you trust is that you also can use them. You were in a cabinet department. You can use them as a lightning rod to draw pain and controversy away from the governor himself. They can have plausible deniability. Say, that Commissioner Socolow, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's part of what you have to be willing to do. And of course, you don't want to be cut adrift and off on an island, but you also don't want to be viewed as sort of having to get Mother May I to answer a simple question from a legislator.
And you felt you had that authority?
I developed it over the 4 years. I didn't understand. It was certainly something I worked on more as time went on. I was certainly much less experienced with it than when I started than as time went on. And I developed trust with everyone, with both the front office people and with the legislature as time went on. Certainly that work on the paid family leave law, where I was doing a whole lot of individual conversations and then telling them after the fact what had happened rather than having to strategize beforehand. So you've got to be in real time talking to people about what their issues are and concerns are.
Did you ever get hung out to dry the way you just described?
Did I ever get hung out to dry? I think I worried about getting hung out to dry. I don't think I ever did. I think I was constantly on guard about it. Yeah.
One final question. What's John Corzine's legacy? If you were writing his biography as governor,
yeah.
What would you say were his primary accomplishments, and what would you say were his greatest shortcomings?
Well, I think one accomplishment clearly has to be the whole panoply of things around reform. So the process level issues of fixing some of the entrenched ways that Trenton had done business that were unsavory. Putting in place some structures, putting in place some discipline in the way the budget was done.
There's discipline in the way the budget is done?
There's a lot more than there had been in the prior years. I mean, certainly the unbelievably dishonest fake revenues or non-recurring revenues that had become the bipartisan way of getting things done. The governor's 4 budgets dramatically reduced the reliance on that. Again, we ended the massive multi-billion dollars of stealing from the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, and many other of those kinds of fund raids were dramatically curtailed and in many cases eliminated, as well as the existence of the comptroller and the ultimate ending of dual office holding and all of that kind of stuff that was on the reform agenda. I mean, the governor really cared about that, really put a lot of energy into it. That's on the process. On the policy side, I mean, there were a whole lot of issues that sort of fall into that social justice agenda that the governor cared about. As you mentioned, when he was running for U.S. Senate, he was espousing a truly visionary and compelling idea about social justice. There was more of that, I think, that he was able to work on as a senator than you can do as governor, but to the extent that we could, we were able to do paid family leave insurance. We were able to, that was something I worked on, but other things, obviously the elimination of the death penalty and some of the work we did on criminal justice reform and many other issues that the governor took on that I was tangentially related to the criminal justice reform as it related to helping people coming out of prison with jobs. But there's a whole lot more that was done that really would be, a key part of his legacy as governor.
And the shortcomings?
I think that the big inflection point about the major fiscal restructuring that was going to make a big dent in our structural problem with the way the state budget is
the
set up.
asset monetization?
Yeah.
We didn't get into that because I didn't think that fell into your bailiwick.
It did not fall into my bailiwick, but obviously I think it colored everything anyone else was working on, because it would, the governor ran for election in '05 saying, I know a lot about debt. We have a massive debt problem. I've been working on bonds on Wall Street. There are some creative things others have thought about in other countries and other states that we could do here that could get us out of this huge problem we have with our pensions and our debt. And ultimately, there was a rollout that wasn't terribly well done to try to create the idea of asset monetization. The relationships that would have needed to be built to make that happen weren't done in advance. It also coincided with the time that the governor had his car accident. And so a whole lot of things that hinged on getting that done so that there was space, fiscal space, economic space, political space, to work on a lot of other things we talked about, like raising the minimum wage, which we haven't talked about, but that was one of my agenda items that we never got that done. We did a commission that every year reported on how much higher the minimum wage should be, and every year the legislature just didn't do anything about it. And the governor at that point was not able to put that on his radar screen. So I think that was obviously I'm sure that if anyone writes a book about the Corzine administration, that set piece in the middle, where asset monetization crashed and burned, led to some lack of capacity to get lots of other things done.
Well, I think every governor who preceded him and the two who have succeeded him would basically say the same thing, that the chronic problems financially that face the state budget,
right,
make it difficult, if not impossible, to do the bigger picture things that every administration would have wanted to do or still wants to do.
Right, and so when you come in and you have a whole set of agenda items, but there's this other thing hanging out there, you have this choice. One is to not do any agenda, which I would argue is what the last 8 years of the prior governor to this was about, and sort of not trying to make the state better in any way, and really just only focusing on doing some things toward that fiscal crisis. And he could only do as much as this state was going to allow him to do. Or you can try to do both. The Corzine administration, I would say, was 4 years of trying to do both. And it's very hard to do both of those things.
And it still is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, David.
Yeah.
It's been an enlightening and entertaining conversation.
For me too. Thanks very much.